The Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell that has Westminster in absolute chaos. Hidden documents, secret meetings, and a plan so controversial that Labour is desperately trying to bury it before the British public finds out. What Keir Starmer thought would stay behind closed doors has just been dragged into the light, and the implications are staggering. This isn't about policy disagreements anymore. This is about trust, sovereignty, and whether the Prime Minister has been telling the British people the truth. The evidence is damning, the timing is suspicious, and the fallout is already beginning. What you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about this government's real agenda. The Supreme Court's latest ruling has sent shockwaves through the corridors of power, and what's emerged is nothing short of explosive. Legal documents that were supposed to remain confidential have now been made public, and they reveal something that Labour has been fighting tooth and nail to keep hidden. We're talking about detailed plans, secret negotiations, and agreements that suggest a much closer relationship with the European Union than Starmer has ever admitted to the British people. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. These are official documents, court-mandated disclosures that paint a very different picture from what we've been told. The timeline alone raises serious questions. Just months after Labour took power, senior ministers were already in Brussels, not for the routine diplomatic meetings they claimed, but for intensive negotiations about regulatory alignment, trade frameworks, and legal integration. The kind of discussions that go far beyond simple cooperation. We're talking about binding commitments, long-term arrangements and policy frameworks that would tie Britain's hands for decades to come. And here's the thing that should concern every British citizen. None of this was in the manifesto. None of this was debated during the election campaign. The British people were promised one thing, and behind the scenes, something entirely different was being negotiated. The Supreme Court's involvement came about because of a Freedom of Information request that the government fought desperately to block. They used every legal mechanism available, cited national security concerns, claimed that disclosure would damage international relations, but the judges weren't buying it. In a unanimous decision, they ruled that the public interest in transparency outweighed the government's arguments for secrecy. And when those documents finally saw the light of day, it became crystal clear why Labour was so desperate to keep them hidden. The level of integration being discussed goes far beyond anything Starmer has publicly acknowledged. We're talking about accepting EU regulations without having any say in making them, aligning our legal system with European court rulings, and potentially even contributing to EU budgets through backdoor arrangements. What makes this even more damaging is the language used in these documents. Internal memos show ministers discussing how to present these plans to the public, how to frame them in ways that wouldn't trigger alarm bells, how to phase in changes gradually so people wouldn't notice until it was too late. One memo explicitly discusses avoiding the term alignment and instead using softer language about cooperation and partnership. Another talks about timing announcements to coincide with other news cycles to minimise media scrutiny. This is calculated deception, plain and simple. This is a government that knew the British people wouldn't accept what they were planning, so they decided to do it quietly and hope nobody noticed. The opposition has already pounced on this. Conservative MPs are calling for an emergency debate, demanding that Starmer come to Parliament and explain himself. Reform UK is going even further, calling for a public inquiry into what they're describing as a betrayal of Brexit and the democratic will of the British people. Even some Labour backbenchers are reportedly furious, feeling that they were kept in the dark about the true extent of these negotiations. The party unity that Starmer has worked so hard to maintain is starting to crack, and the cracks are appearing in very public ways. But it's not just politicians who are angry. The reaction from the British public has been swift and fierce. Social media is exploding with demands for accountability, for resignations, for answers. People feel lied to. And rightfully so. Brexit was supposed to be about taking back control, about Britain making its own decisions, charting its own course. Instead, what these documents suggest is a slow, deliberate process of giving that control away again just through different mechanisms and under different names. The sense of betrayal is palpable and it's spreading fast. The legal implications are staggering. Constitutional experts are already debating whether these agreements, if implemented, would even be legal without explicit parliamentary approval. Some are arguing that such fundamental changes to Britain's relationship with the EU would require not just a vote in Parliament, but potentially even a referendum. After all, the British people voted to leave the EU in 2016. If the government is now planning to essentially rejoin through the back door, doesn't that deserve the same level of democratic scrutiny? These aren't minor technical adjustments. These are fundamental questions about sovereignty, democracy, and who really governs Britain. The details emerging from these Supreme Court documents are even more troubling when you examine them closely. One section deals with regulatory alignment in key industries, particularly manufacturing, agriculture, and financial services. The proposals would essentially require British businesses to follow EU regulations, even though Britain is no longer part of the EU and has no representation in the institutions that make those regulations. Think about what that means in practice. Brussels could pass a new regulation tomorrow and British businesses would be legally required to comply with no British input into whether that regulation makes sense, whether it's proportionate, whether it serves British interests. That's not cooperation, that's subordination. The agricultural sector is particularly concerning. Documents reveal discussions about aligning British farming standards with EU requirements, which sounds reasonable on the surface until you realise what it actually means. British farmers would be bound by EU environmental regulations, pesticide restrictions, and animal welfare standards that might be completely inappropriate for British farming conditions. And if the EU decides to tighten those standards, British farmers have to comply or lose access to markets. Meanwhile, farmers in France or Germany get to vote on those standards through their MEPs. British farmers get no such representation. They just have to accept whatever Brussels decides. How is that taking back control? The financial services section is equally alarming. London has been the financial capital of Europe for decades, but these documents suggest giving EU regulators significant oversight over British financial institutions. We're talking about the European Central Bank and European banking authorities having powers to inspect British banks, to demand changes to their operations, to effectively regulate a huge chunk of the British economy. The City of London, which generates enormous tax revenue for the UK, would be operating under rules made in Frankfurt and enforced by European bureaucrats. The competitive advantage that Brexit was supposed to provide, the regulatory flexibility that would let London adapt faster than EU-bound financial centres, would be thrown away before it was even properly used. What's particularly insidious is how these arrangements are structured. They're not presented as membership or even associate membership. They're framed as technical agreements, cooperation frameworks, memorandums of understanding. The kind of administrative arrangements that don't require big parliamentary votes or public debate. But when you add them all up, when you look at the cumulative effect, you're talking about EU control over vast swaths of British policy without Britain having any say in making that policy. It's the worst of both worlds. All the obligations of membership with none of the benefits, none of the voting rights, none of the influence. The Supreme Court judgment specifically highlighted concerns about democratic accountability. The judges noted that these arrangements would create what they called a democratic deficit, where significant decisions affecting British citizens would be made by institutions they don't elect and can't hold accountable. That's a polite way of saying this is fundamentally undemocratic. In a functioning democracy, the people who make the rules should be answerable to the people who have to follow those rules. Under these proposals, British voters would have no mechanism to challenge or change regulations that affect their lives, their businesses, their communities. They just have to accept whatever Brussels decides and hope for the best. The timing of when these negotiations took place is also revealing. Labour took power, promising stability, promising to fix the economy, promising to make Brexit work. But within weeks, senior ministers were already in Brussels laying the groundwork for these arrangements, which suggests this was always the plan. This wasn't a response to unforeseen circumstances or economic pressure. This was premeditated. They went into the election knowing what they intended to do, and they deliberately chose not to tell the British people about it. That's not a mistake or an oversight. That's a calculated decision to deceive the electorate. Internal communications revealed in the court documents show ministers discussing potential public backlash. One email chain talks about the need to manage expectations and frame the narrative carefully. Another discusses polling data showing strong public opposition to closer EU ties and strategises about how to implement these policies without triggering that opposition. There's even discussion of using statutory instruments rather than primary legislation wherever possible, specifically to avoid lengthy parliamentary debates that might attract media attention. Now, this is government by stealth policy making designed to avoid democratic scrutiny. The constitutional implications extend beyond just EU relations. What this reveals is a government that sees Parliament and public opinion as obstacles to be managed rather than as legitimate sources of democratic authority. The attitude reflected in these documents is that the government knows best, and if the public doesn't agree, the solution is to avoid asking them rather than to make the case openly and honestly. That's a dangerous precedent regardless of what you think about the EU. Today, it's regulatory alignment. Tomorrow, it could be anything. Once you establish that major policy decisions can be made in secret and implemented without proper democratic oversight, you've undermined the foundations of parliamentary democracy. The political fallout is intensifying by the hour. Keir Starmer tried to get ahead of the story with a statement claiming these documents have been mischaracterised and that Labour remains committed to making Brexit work. But that defence is ringing hollow when people can read the actual documents for themselves. The language is clear, the intentions are obvious, and no amount of spin can change what's written in black and white. When your defence relies on arguing that people are misunderstanding plain English, you've already lost the argument. Senior Conservative figures are having a field day with this. Former Brexit Secretary David Davis called it the most serious breach of trust between a government and the electorate in modern British history. Suella Braverman described it as a conspiracy against the democratic will of the British people. Even more moderate Tory voices are expressing shock at the scope of what was being planned. This isn't just opposition politicians scoring political points. This is genuine concern across the political spectrum about whether democratic norms are being respected. Reform UK is taking an even harder line. Nigel Farage has already announced plans for nationwide protests, calling on people to demand Starmer's resignation. Whether you like Farage or not, he's tapping into real anger. Millions of people voted for Brexit because they wanted Britain to be independent, to make its own decisions. Those people feel betrayed, and they're making their voices heard. The rallies being organised are drawing significant numbers, and the mood is angry. People aren't just disappointed, they're furious that after years of Brexit debates, after promises that the issue was settled, it turns out their own government was working to undo it all behind their backs. Within Labour itself, the situation is becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Backbench MPs who represent Leave voting constituencies are facing serious pressure from their constituents. Some are already breaking ranks, publicly criticising the leadership and demanding fuller disclosure of what was discussed in these Brussels meetings. One Labour MP told reporters that they felt blindsided by the revelations, and that many colleagues share their concerns but are afraid to speak out. That kind of internal dissent is exactly what Starmer doesn't need right now. His authority is being questioned not just by opponents but by his own party. The media coverage has been relentless. Even outlets that typically support Labour are asking tough questions. How much did Starmer personally know about these negotiations? Who authorised these discussions? Were cabinet members kept informed? Or was this being run by a small group of advisors? Why was Parliament not consulted about agreements that would have such significant constitutional implications? These are basic questions of governance and accountability, and the government's answers have been evasive and unsatisfying. When you're losing the argument, even with friendly media, you know you're in serious trouble. International reaction has been interesting too. EU officials are reportedly embarrassed by the leak, concerned that it makes them look like they were complicit in deceiving the British public. Some European politicians are distancing themselves from the revelations, claiming they assumed any agreements would be transparent and democratically approved. Whether that's genuine or just damage control is debatable, but it shows how toxic this has become. Even Brussels doesn't want to be associated with what looks like an attempt to undermine democratic decision-making. The economic arguments that Labour is trying to make aren't landing either. Yes, closer ties with the EU might provide some economic benefits in certain sectors. But at what cost? Economic convenience doesn't justify democratic deficit. The British people were willing to accept potential economic disruption to achieve independence. They made that choice knowingly in 2016. For the government to now argue that economic considerations justify secret agreements that undermine that choice is to fundamentally misunderstand what Brexit was about. It wasn't primarily an economic decision. It was a democratic one. Legal challenges are already being prepared. Several organisations are planning to take the government to court, arguing that implementing these agreements without explicit parliamentary approval would be unconstitutional. The Supreme Court ruling has given them ammunition. If the judges thought these documents needed to be public because of their constitutional significance, that implies implementing them without proper democratic process would be legally questionable at best. We could be looking at months or even years of legal battles over whether this government has the authority to do what these documents suggest they were planning. The impact on public trust is perhaps the most serious long-term consequence. Regardless of how this plays out legally or politically, millions of people now believe their government tried to deceive them about something fundamental. That kind of trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild. Future governments will face scepticism about their real intentions, demands for greater transparency, suspicion about what's being discussed behind closed doors. Starmer might have thought he was being clever by negotiating quietly, but what he's actually done is corrode the relationship between government and governed. That damage will last long after this particular scandal has faded from the headlines.